The Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation that almost led to nuclear war and the destruction of the entire world. The Cold War led up to this near catastrophe, and it is widely agreed that the Cuban Missile Crisis is the high point of tensions between Russia, which was a communist country, and the United States of America, which was a strongly anti-communist country. The United States was under the leadership of President John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia was under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. Both leaders were instrumental in the crisis. During the Cold War, fear of communism and of Russia ran wild in the American population, as shown by this Cold War propaganda poster. Khrushchev and Kennedy were often pictured struggling for domination in such propaganda during this era. The tensions between America and communism were strained even more when Cuba, an island nation just 90 miles from the mainland of the United States, was turned into a communist state by Fidel Castro, who seized power and became the dictator of Cuba. Because Cuba was now a communist country, Khrushchev and the Soviet Union became allies with Cuba. These events all were causes that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which almost led to nuclear war and the unthinkable prospect of nuclear Armageddon. Once Cuba became communist and the Soviet Union became allies with the island nation, the Soviets began to secretly make nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. They did this because they felt threatened by the United States nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey, which could easily destroy the entire Soviet Union. In Khrushchev's eyes, the nuclear missiles being stationed on Cuba simply leveled the playing field and put the Soviet Union on level ground with the United States. On October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane on a standard surveillance flight photographed the previously secret nuclear missile sites on Cuba. This led President Kennedy of the United States to issue a message to the American people alerting them to the missiles and what actions he was going to take. Here is part of the broadcast.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The missile sites being built on Cuba were made to launch both medium-range ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles. These types of missiles had the capability to strike almost anywhere in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and South America. The destructive capabilities of these nuclear missiles were huge, and they could easily destroy most of the Western Hemisphere. President Kennedy met with his advisors to decide on a course of action. Many of his advisors suggested an airstrike to destroy the missiles, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Some of his other advisors suggested he simply give a warning to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Here are some handwritten notes of President Kennedy, which he used to brainstorm ideas to resolve the situation. After much debate and deliberation, however, President Kennedy decided to go with a mix of what his advisors had suggested. He decided to put a naval quarantine on Cuba that would prevent any more offensive weapons from being delivered to the island nation. Here is a portion of his address to the American people alerting them to his decision.
Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
The quarantine placed on Cuba raised tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the American people feared for their safety. Many citizens, as shown here, asked for a peaceful end to the tensions. President Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev informing him of the quarantine, and Khrushchev replied saying that Soviet ships bound for Cuba would not back down. However, none of the ships bound for Cuba were found to be carrying offensive weapons, and so they were allowed to pass. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message saying that nuclear war should be avoided at all costs, and that a diplomatic solution should be found to avoid a nuclear Armageddon. Khrushchev gave Kennedy an offer to remove the missile sites from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade the island. The next day, Khrushchev sent another message to President Kennedy saying that any deal made would need to include the removal of the American missiles stationed in Turkey. The day the second message was sent, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, which raised tensions further and made a diplomatic solution seem improbable. President Kennedy decided upon a course of action. He responded only to Khrushchev's first message, ignoring the second message, and outlining a plan to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba under United States supervision. Secretly, however, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, met with the Soviet ambassador and informed him that the American missiles in Turkey were going to be removed anyway, but that their removal could not be a part of any public deal. On October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that the missiles would be removed from Cuba, officially bringing the Cuban Missile Crisis to a close. The quarantine of Cuba was ended on November 20th, and the American missiles in Turkey were removed in April 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands today as the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war, and serves as a reminder of how we must never allow such a thing to happen for the sake of the human race.